Hello, you haven't really reached anything. You're watching me, and I'm reading my first ever book. Well, it's my first book. It's called Opus Tsunami. Now, here's the thing about Opus Tsunami. It's not a full-length book. I wrote a mini book, kind of like a novella. The purpose of it was basically to share information that I personally find fascinating. And that information, of course, is about tsunamis. Opus Tsunami is all about how terrifying a tsunami can be. So we're talking about this unimaginable power, the unimaginable destruction. We're talking about tectonic plates shifting and sending entire oceans moving. That's terrifying. And I have a bit of experience with tsunamis, having been somewhat near the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami while I was vacationing in Thailand. Now, I wasn't where a lot of the destruction was. I wasn't where you see those giant waves smashing apart beach resorts on that's all over the videos. That was broadcast around the world back then, 2004. That wasn't that long ago. But I was there, and yeah, I've had a lifelong fascination with tsunamis ever since. At the time that it was going on, where I was, there wasn't that level of destruction. Nobody died where I was. I didn't see bodies or anything like that. There was giant waves. There was the ocean coming in like right up over the beach. But everyone remained calm, and the local Thai people just seemed so, blasé about it. So I thought maybe this is just a weird tide, maybe something that they're used to. I didn't realize at the time that this was one of the largest and most destructive natural disasters in human history. Now, we're talking about more than a dozen countries affected. We're talking about, well, the statistics are really hard because the body count was so high and spread across so many different countries that exact counts are hard to come by. So the low ball figure is over 250,000 dead. So that's over 250,000 dead. That's the lowest figure. The high mark is over 340,000 dead. So the figures, depending on what sources you use, they all change. Um, I've had a lifelong fascination with tsunamis ever since then. Um, I ended up learning everything I could about tsunamis, watching every video, reading every book, particularly the all the books and the literature surrounding the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Now, less than 6 years after that came another giant tsunami that hit Japan in 2011, and that killed another 30 to 40,000 people. Again, when you're dealing with such huge numbers, it doesn't matter how advanced the country is. It is so hard to get an exact count, um, especially with tsunamis, and we'll learn why. But the fact of the matter is, there's not many bodies left after a tsunami. There's some, but the majority of them get dragged out to sea and lost forever. And it's a sad fact about tsunamis. So, yeah. The scary thing is, another one is coming. It could come. I mean, it could come in 10 years. It could come in the next hour. And where it's going to hit is the scary part, especially if you live in North America. So, without further ado, let's read Opus Tsunami. All right, so I'm reading directly from the book. You can find Opus Tsunami on Kindle. It's only $1.99. The reason for that is Amazon wouldn't let me give it away for free. My whole idea was to give this away for free. But if you do want it for free, You can sign up at my website. You can sign up. You'll get a monthly newsletter, maybe bi-monthly. I don't send them out that much. It's not that much, not really spam. But what you'll be doing is really supporting my work, and I'll give you free ebooks every time one of these mini ebooks comes out. So let's start reading. Now I'm skipping past the introduction, and some information I'm going to skip, and that's because it doesn't really fit into this kind of format. So if you do want to read the whole thing in full, then I advise you, I urge you to get the book. So $1.99 on Amazon, or free if you sign up, and there's a link. There should be a link available on the screen that you're looking at. All right, so let's start reading. The first chapter is just called 2004. Tsunamis are created. They happen when massive amounts of water get displaced by powerful forces. Now, on December 26, 2004, that powerful force was a megathrust earthquake. This particular earthquake registered 9.3 on the Richter scale, and this is the third largest earthquake in recorded history. Now, for the people of Sumatra and western Indonesia, the earthquake was devastating. It took them by surprise at 7:53 in the morning. That's just as people were getting to work, kids were getting ready for school, etc. The earthquake knocked down buildings, it toppled walls and trees. And now what surprised a lot of people was the duration of the earthquake, which rocked Sumatra for nearly 10 minutes. The residents of the largest city in this part of Indonesia, Banda Aceh, I hope I pronounced that right, Banda Aceh, had grown used to earthquakes. For decades, there had been an increasing number of minor tremors, but they caused relatively little damage and lasted seconds. Very few people understood that these tremors were a warning of what was coming. 100 miles west of Sumatra, 20 miles under the ocean, the Indian plate had been slowly sliding under the Burma plate in a process known as subduction. For centuries, these two enormous tectonic plates had been wrestling, with the Indian plate crawling ever so slowly underneath the other. Now, these are tectonic plates. Their mass and their scale boggle the mind. Entire continents sit on top of these things. But what was happening with this particular subduction zone was that the large pieces of rock from the Indian plate were snagging on the bottom of the Burma plate above it, and they were kind of sliding over top of each other. As the two plates continued to move, one over the other, pressure built up where the plates were snagged. This pressure had been building up for centuries. The last great Sumatra earthquake occurred on November 25, 1833. This megathrust earthquake measured 8.8 on the Richter scale, and it killed, and I quote, numerous people, according to sources there at the time. The earthquake was big enough to make newspapers in Europe on the other side of the world. There were reports of a massive tsunami which devastated the region, particularly west of Sumatra, but eyewitness accounts are very rare. That area of the world was not developed then, and you didn't get many contemporary eyewitnesses around to witness a tsunami. Anyways, I'll get back to it. Then, between 1833 and 2004, there were numerous smaller earthquakes, some measuring as high as 7.9. Most of these were small, localized tremors. However, in 2000 and again in 2002, there were large quakes which killed 50 people in Banda Aceh. Then, on that fateful Boxing Day in 2004, the Indian plate suddenly snapped up. This was the Sunda megathrust earthquake. The epicenter of the earthquake was just off the coast of Indonesia, but it wasn't localized. So more than 900 miles of the plate suddenly raised up, forming a jagged cliff underneath the water. This cliff was 60 feet high, and it was like the bottom of the ocean floor just suddenly popped up. The earth literally ripped itself open. The earthquake could be felt around the world. Seismic sensors in Hawaii, 7,000 miles away, registered these tremors. In fact, the earthquake tilted the Earth on its axis by 200 millimeters and shortened the day by 2.6 microseconds. The Earth quite literally wobbled in space. For the people closest to the epicenter, it was devastating. In Banda Aceh, entire buildings fell apart. Roads cracked open and cars were swallowed by sinkholes. Nobody knows how many were killed by the earthquake, because there was barely time to recover from the horrible shaking when a wall of water suddenly appeared over the city. The city of Banda Aceh is the capital of Aceh province in Indonesia. This is a predominantly Muslim city. It's also an old city. It was founded in the 15th century by the Sultan of Aceh. Its name, Banda Aceh, loosely translates to port in Aceh. In 2004, Banda Aceh's population numbered somewhere in the vicinity of 300,000 people. However, this is a very poor city in a very poor province of a developing country. Corruption and inefficiency are rampant, which makes accurate census information hard to come by. And as an aside, it also makes it really difficult to get a body count. Now, we'll go back. Since 2010, the standard of living has risen, but in 2004, as the Sunda megathrust rocked Sumatra, the people of Aceh and its ramshackle capital were considered to live below the global poverty line of $2 a day. In addition to poverty, this region of Indonesia was strife with ethnic and religious conflict. Between 1976 and 2005, the central Indonesian government fought a bloody civil war with separatist groups who wished for Aceh to become an independent country. The people of Aceh generally saw themselves as distinct from the rest of the country. After all, this is where Islam first entered the region. Before that momentous day, the ethnic tribes of the area were never united with the other islands that make up modern-day Indonesia. And as a side, I should note that it was the Dutch who kind of banded all these different tribes and islands together into a modern country called Indonesia. It was a Dutch colony for quite a while. Okay, we'll go back to the book. According to Edward Aspinall, who is an academic with the Australian National University, the conflict in Aceh province follows a historical path. And I'll quote, Acehese rebelliousness under Indonesian rule was path-dependent. It can be traced to particular historical events and conflicts of interest, notably the autonomy that the modernist ulama Muslim religious scholars enjoyed during the revolution, and the dramatic loss of it immediately after. Aspinall continues, and I quote again, Aceh played an important role in the revolution and war of independence against the Dutch, and consequently was allegedly able to extract a promise from then-President Sukarno during his 1947 visit to Aceh that it would be allowed to implement Islamic law, or Sharia, following independence. That's from Aspinall's report called Insurgency in Aceh, and that was a direct quote from Edward Aspinall's report. So, back to the book. The combination of poverty and conflict meant that Banda Aceh was not a good place to be on the morning of December 26, 2004. Many women and children may have been victims of the earthquake, as they would have been at home preparing for school when it happened. Most ramshackle houses and cheaply constructed buildings collapsed in the quake. Meanwhile, most men would have been out and about at work. Because most of the work in Banda Aceh is manual labor, and most of it is outdoors, they fared the earthquake better. The women and children would have been indoors where things were collapsing. But neither group of people could have known what was coming their way. See, what happened was when the megathrust happened, it displaced billions of tons of ocean water. The Indian plate suddenly reared up and pushed a 20-mile column of water upwards. One of the biggest tsunamis in history was born. That wall of water hit Banda Aceh first, it being the closest city to the epicenter of the earthquake. Now, the tsunami didn't take long to reach the shore. In fact, experts agree that within 30 minutes of the earthquake, a 100-foot-high water wall suddenly towered over the stricken city. Unfortunately, there are no survivors from the coastal part of the city who could tell us what they saw. However, there were some survivors on nearby islands where the tsunami simply washed over, and they reported a massive black wave making explosion sounds and which sucked the air from their lungs. That would be the impact of the tsunami hitting the ground, and the impact was so hard that it was leaving a shockwave behind. At 100 feet, or 30 meters, it would have darkened the sky. It was the size of a 10-story apartment building, stretching from horizon to horizon, and it was moving at 600 miles per hour. That's 1,000 kilometers an hour for us metric people. That's as fast as a jet airplane. One of the pleasant things about Banda Aceh is that there are neither tides nor typhoons in the region. While this helps make everyday living a little easier, it also presents problems when a monster tsunami is on the way. For starters, on most coasts, tides and typhoons erode the coastline. That helps create breaks in the ocean floor that can absorb some of the impact of a tsunami. Also, both tides and typhoons keep people living further away from the waterline. But Banda Aceh had a smooth, solid shoreline with houses and buildings constructed right up to the waterline. The result was that the tsunami rolled unimpeded over these hapless people. A towering wave would have crashed down on top of the buildings with millions of tons of weight. It was like giant skyscrapers just smashing down out of the sky. Everything would have been crushed. No living thing could have survived that or outran it. The wall of water hit the shore with such force that it sheared the sides off of cliffs along the coastlines. And as an aside, I've read some reports that it left a dent in the shoreline where the crest of the wave crashed down. Like a literal trench was formed in the ground from the weight of this tsunami. Anyways, back to the book. For the victims of the initial impact, death would have come instantly. Many would not have known what hit them, stunned as they were by the earthquake. After that wall of water crashed down, it became a torrent that rapidly pushed inland. It picked up houses and boats and cars and trees and boulders, and of course people too. Once moving inland, the tsunami was no longer a wave, but a fast-moving flood. It tore up the streets of Banda Aceh. It was pushed forward by its own momentum and from the mass of water coming up behind it. It didn't trickle, but roared forward like a solid mass, smashing everything in its path. This flood was 40 feet tall and moved at over 50 miles per hour. Researcher Jose C. Borrero, who investigated Banda Aceh for the Earthquake Engineering Institute following the disaster, said this about the tsunami that swept through the city, quote, "Within 2 to 3 kilometers of the shoreline, houses, except for strongly built reinforced concrete ones with brick walls, which seemed to have been partially damaged by the earthquake before the tsunami, were swept away or destroyed by the tsunami. The area toward the sea was wiped clean of nearly every structure, while closer to the river, dense construction and a commercial district showed the effects of severe flooding. The flow depth at the city was just at the level of the second floor, and there were large amounts of debris piled along the streets and in the ground floor storefronts." End quote. That was from Jose Borrero, and he, like I said, he did an investigation for the Earthquake Engineering Institute, which you can find online. So, back to the book. The deluge was just like a swirling blender. Anybody who got sucked into it was shredded apart by fast-moving debris. There were corrugated metal roofs, mopeds, rocks, trees, boats, furniture, and a myriad of other debris that was all swirling around. All through the city, the people who hadn't been smashed by the impact of the wave found themselves running for their lives. Most couldn't outrun it in the cramped, disorganized streets of Banda Aceh, and found themselves swept up, disappearing into the black mass which devoured their city block by block. Those who climbed tall buildings had no chance of salvation. The tsunami swept away almost every building in Banda Aceh except for a few strongly constructed mosques. The wall of water raced inland nearly 5 miles until it ran up against hills and mountains. But in the rivers and valleys that ran through the mountains, the tsunami continued on. Researchers discovered that the tsunami traveled up the Aceh River, which runs south from Banda Aceh through the mountains of Sumatra. Evidence of the deluge was found 25 miles inland, with destroyed villages and smashed jungle all along the river. Riding on top of the first wave were a series of 12 more tsunami waves, measuring between 30 feet and 10 feet each. They rushed over top of each other, washing away the city and pummeling the coastline. Finally, after nearly an hour of death and destruction, the water receded back to the ocean. It ran away quickly, dragging an immense field of debris and corpses with it. In fact, this backflow of the ocean as it returned can result in additional damage to structures. Of the tens of thousands of people killed in Banda Aceh, only a few thousand bodies were ever recovered. Most of them were carried out to sea and lost to eternity. Survivors were left with nothing. No homes, no family, and no bodies to bury to bring any closure. Sumatra bore the brunt of the tsunami, being as close as it was to the epicenter of the earthquake. The death toll in Indonesia, as a direct result of the earthquake and tsunami, was more than 167,000. More than 50,000 people were permanently injured as a result, either losing limbs or being paralyzed. Worse still was the effect that the tsunami had on infrastructure in an extremely fragile region of the world. Wells and aquifers were swamped and polluted, roads and bridges were washed away, all power and plumbing had vanished, and millions of tons of sea salt mixed with oils and chemicals had seeped into the ground. Those who survived the tsunami found themselves standing in a dystopian nightmare. As the tsunami radiated outwards from the earthquake's epicenter, it spread across the entire Indian Ocean. Although Indonesia suffered horrific devastation, the tsunami was still traveling as fast as a jetliner, making straight for the next landmass in its way: Thailand. So, now then, we move on to Chapter 2, Thailand. Unlike Sumatra, Thailand is a tourist paradise in Southeast Asia. Even then, in 2004, Thailand welcomed more than 11 million tourists to its calm, sunny beaches and resorts. Things like an advanced tourist-centered economy, a stable democratic government, and beautiful tropic locations made Thailand one of the top 20 tourist locations in the world. And as an aside, when I say a stable democratic government, I'm talking about in comparison to many of the other countries in this region. Thailand is definitely much more stable than, say, Indonesia or Sri Lanka. Get back to the book. Of course, Thailand wasn't on par with developed nations. It was still a poor country, with millions of inhabitants living below the poverty line. Corruption was, and still is, rampant, and it boasted then, as it still does today, one of the largest sex industries in the world. Thailand for centuries has called itself the land of 1,000 smiles, a nice sobriquet that can be interpreted many different ways. On Boxing Day 2004, tens of thousands of tourists were enjoying their breakfast. Most of these people were North Americans, Europeans, and Australians. For the Thai people who lived along the coast, they had begun their day much like in Banda Aceh. Children were off to school, men and women were both off to work. As an aside, it's important to note that women in Thailand are much freer than they are in, say, Indonesia. They, education, work, career, stuff like that. So it's big cultural differences between the two countries. All right. Let's return to that beautiful morning in Thailand. The weather that morning was gorgeous. The sun was out, and a nice breeze off the Indian Ocean kept everyone cool. A few puffy white clouds dotted the sky here and there. Most of Thailand's tropical tourist destinations are clustered around an area known as the Andaman Sea. This part of the eastern Indian Ocean rarely experiences earthquakes, typhoons, or other disasters, making it a prime spot for a vacation. As a result, the islands and peninsulas of the region are covered in tourist traps. The main island in the region is Phuket, which also happens to contain the largest concentration of beach resorts. Just to the north of Phuket, on the mainland, are Khao Lak and Phang Nga, other heavily built-up tourist areas. There are a series of islands offshore of Phuket, including Koh Phi Phi. This entire region was about to be hit by the tsunami that hit Indonesia. The tsunami struck Khao Lak first. This area is famous with divers for crystal clear waters and coral reefs, but there are also plenty of villages and towns along the coast. Tourists and locals alike noticed the water draw out away from the coast, leaving large outcroppings of rocks visible, and stranding Thai fishing boats and water taxis on the seabed. In a BBC article highlighting survivor stories, one woman recounted, "The waders were all pointing at the sea, which was receding rapidly. It was a fascinating sight. People got their cameras out and walked towards the dry seabed. The beach was full of sunbathing tourists." That's from Tsunami Stories on BBC. You can check it out on the website. Back to the book. Then, less than a minute later, a massive wall of water appeared on the horizon. Like other places in Thailand, the tsunami didn't approach Khao Lak as a wave, but rather as a deluge of angry, boiling ocean. It rolled forward at incredible speed. The front of it towered 32 feet over the town, roaring loudly and shaking the earth as it came. The effects of the tsunami on Khao Lak were similar to Banda Aceh. The deluge swept up the beach at incredible speed and smashed apart every structure for 2 miles inland. It ripped apart the ground itself, washing away all the palm trees and plants that made this city a tourist paradise. However, unlike with Banda Aceh, we have a wealth of video footage of the tsunami. After all, there were thousands of tourists there with cameras and mobile phones. You can watch that terrifying torrent of water as it smashes onto the beach on YouTube. I mean, there's a million videos on YouTube with Khao Lak. What you'll notice when you watch is this panic screaming and yelling as people run for their lives, and the roaring water. The Khao Lak Explorer, a tourist organization for the city, said this about the tsunami that hit the city on their website. The images of the wall of water that was then unleashed and that can be seen mercilessly approaching the shore like an unstoppable juggernaut are burnt in the memories of many survivors, as well as the families of the thousands of victims the tsunami claimed. The same goes for the many screams of fear and anguish, and the cries for help that can be heard on the videos shot by people fleeing for their lives. That's from an article on their website, Tsunami in Khao Lak, by the Khao Lak Explorer. Back to the book. The majority of tourists of Thailand who died in the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami lost their lives in Khao Lak. It took the brunt of the tsunami, which hadn't lost any of its power when it hit. All told, 4,500 people died in that tiny resort town, including the king of Thailand's grandson. But the tsunami wasn't finished with Thailand. Moments after it hit Khao Lak, the tsunami smashed apart Phuket. And when it hit, it came as a massive 60-foot wave which suddenly reared up from the ocean. Again, as in other parts of Thailand, the city was packed with tourists who had digital cameras to record the ensuing disaster. In these videos, we see the huge wave roll forward, growing taller and taller as it approaches. People hanging out on the beach seem a little unsure and step back a bit. They must have been thinking, "This looks like a big wave." But most probably didn't doubt that it would stay out there in the ocean. However, as it reared up taller and taller, panic set in and everyone started running for their lives. The wave that slammed into Patong Beach along the Phuket waterfront hit a much more urbanized area than Khao Lak. There were plenty of sturdy concrete buildings that survived the deluge, lots of hotels there. So the water turned into a flood that roared between the buildings, through streets and alleyways for several miles inland. It swept up anything that wasn't bolted down, and any person who was caught in the open went with it. Just like with tsunamis everywhere, the torrent quickly turned into a swirling blender of fast-moving debris. Thankfully, of the thousands of people in Phuket, the vast majority survived by climbing to the tops of tall hotel buildings. Still, over 250 people lost their lives in Phuket, each death a tragedy for their families and communities. One survivor, an American named Mark Oberle, wrote this on his personal blog. "I heard an explosion and saw a roiling black mass of water next to a waterfront hotel. I thought it was a sewer line breaking. Marty," I think that was his girlfriend or friend, "thought it was a dam failure, and many others thought it was a terrorist attack." Quickly after, there were more distant explosions to the north up the beach, sounding like cannon fire. The explosions were from the initial large waves slapping into the concrete buildings as the waves successfully reached different points up the beach. Then I saw a swell of floodwater heading our way, perhaps just a 3 to 4 foot deep plateau of water with a roiling mass of water and debris at the leading edge. Then I finally realized it was a tsunami, related to the earthquake 2 hours earlier. However, even at that point, I thought it was a small tsunami and did not understand the magnitude of the disaster because our view of the coast was blocked by the palms and line of beachfront hotels. Again, that's from Mark Oberle, and you can read that on his blog. Back to the book. All along the Indian Ocean coastline of Thailand, the same scenes played out. On Koh Phi Phi, the tsunami smashed apart the little spit of sand that housed most of the island's tourists and workers. In a strange phenomenon called wraparound, the tsunami actually wrapped around the southern part of the island and smashed Koh Phi Phi's spit of sand a second time from the other side. On the northern peninsula of the island, the wave washed completely over the land, from the western beach, over the cliffs and jungle, and into the ocean on the eastern side of the island. It took everything and everyone with it. Famous videos, shown again and again around the world, of massive waves crashing down on the beach through a thin line of palm trees highlights the power of the wave that hit Koh Phi Phi. It was the second most devastated region in Thailand after Khao Lak, and 4,000 people lost their lives there. Most of them were on that tiny spit of sand between the two bays. The tsunami hit tourist hotspots like Krabi, Damson, and Raidan. The coastal research station at Hat Praphat was swept away by the wave. All told, more than 8,000 people lost their lives in Thailand, and a further 5,000 were washed away, declared missing, and never seen again. But this was still only the beginning of the disaster. Sri Lanka was next. Chapter 3. Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is a tiny nation. The island lays south of the Indian subcontinent and is only 26,000 square miles in size. That makes it the 120th largest country out of 194 countries in the world. It's small. Also, much like with Indonesia, in 2004, Sri Lanka was one of the poorest countries on Earth and was also dealing with a decades-long conflict between ethnic minorities. In fact, Sri Lanka then, as now, is the second poorest country in South Asia. Only the Maldives are poorer in terms of GDP and the economic power of its people. With one of the largest tsunamis in history bearing down on this tiny poor island, a great tragedy was about to unfold. And you'll have to give me one moment. I really need to cough, so I'm just going to break for a second. Okay, now we're back. Thank you for waiting. Sorry about that. Where were we? We're talking about the Sri Lanka tsunami. So the southern and eastern coasts of Sri Lanka are where most of the country's tourist traps were located. But in 2004, those were the two coasts that would be hit the hardest by the tsunami. And while many tourists would lose their lives in Sri Lanka, the vast majority of casualties would be Sri Lankan. The first waves to reach Sri Lanka struck at 09:28 in the morning, local time. It had only been 2 hours since the earthquake, and less than an hour since the tsunami struck Thailand. The first wave to hit Sri Lanka struck along the eastern coast and was registered at 1 meter in height, that's about 3 feet. This wave smashed ashore and quickly inundated the beach area, but did little other damage. Curious locals and tourists alike wandered down to the beach to check out what had happened. This was a fatal mistake. The following waves rolled over top of the water left behind by the first wave, and these were deadly. In fact, the second wave, which hit only a few minutes later, was over 30 feet tall. The tsunami had not lost its power or intensity in its path across the Indian Ocean, and like with Thailand, this 30-foot wall of water smashed ashore and swallowed everything in its path. Al Jazeera, the news agency, ran a piece showcasing survivor stories of the tsunami. A Sri Lankan man, Amutan Raghavan, told them this harrowing tale, and I quote this from the Al Jazeera article. "I was out in the garden when I heard yelling and shouting. I looked down and saw this terrible flood washing in from the sea and through the village. Amuthan joined in the fleeing crowd. They were running in all directions, and I knew that they would be safe up on the hill in the Kovil. Over 150 people sheltered at the Kovil. By the end of the day, many were searching for loved ones." End quote. That was from Dinu Colombage, who is a reporter with Al Jazeera, and you can read that on the Al Jazeera website. Back to the book. One of the most famous stories that came out of the Sri Lanka tsunami was the destruction of the Queen of the Sea holiday train. This was a regularly scheduled train that runs along the coast from Sri Lanka's biggest city, Colombo, to the tropical paradise of Gale. Don't know how to pronounce that. Because it was both the Christmas season and a Buddhist holiday, the train was packed with more than 2,000 people. At 9:30 in the morning, the train was right beside the eastern coastline when a raging torrent of water, moving at 200 miles per hour, washed over it from the ocean. The train was carried away along with all of its passengers. It was smashed to pieces and wreckage was littered for miles inland. British traveller Shenth Ravindra survived the wreck. He gave an interview to BBC in 2004. And quote, "Suddenly I felt a shunt and the train moved off the tracks. I could see it being detached from the other carriages, as the water rushed in and started to tilt, at which point I fell against one of the doorways." That is from an article by Becky Anderson for BBC, written in 2004. Back to the book. Shen's carriage got flung inland and wedged between two trees. As it quickly filled up with water, he managed to climb to the roof and jump on top of a nearby house. In all, more than 1,700 people were killed on this one train, making it the biggest railway disaster in human history. There were only a few hundred survivors. All along the eastern and southern coastlines of Sri Lanka, the same scenes are played out as in Thailand and Indonesia. The waves pounded the shoreline, destroying everything in their path and washing away all of the infrastructure and any buildings which weren't made of steel and concrete. People who were swept up in the water were smashed to pieces by the fast-moving, swirling debris. But something different happened with Sri Lanka, and researchers had never expected it to happen. In fact, it was the first time that they ever saw this. It's called tsunami refraction. Basically, the tsunami reflected off the Maldives, which lay west of Sri Lanka, bounced back eastward from where they had just come, and caused a second series of tsunami waves to smash Sri Lanka from the west. In this way, both coasts of Sri Lanka were battered. Surprisingly, these waves that had refracted off the Maldives lost little of their power, despite bouncing off some islands and traveling a few hundred miles backwards. When they struck Sri Lanka's west coast, they ranged in height from 10 feet to 30 feet and flooded most of the shoreline and killed thousands more. All told, more than 30,000 people were killed by the tsunami in Sri Lanka, but the effects of the disaster would continue to kill long afterwards. Because Sri Lanka's infrastructure and economy were so fragile, the population was extremely vulnerable to even the slightest upset. The scale of the disaster overwhelmed the country's ability to deal, and as clean water wells were saturated and thousands of bodies putrefied along the coast, a cholera pandemic broke out. The World Health Organization estimates that a further 7,000 people died by cholera in the weeks following the tsunami. Every country around the Indian Ocean felt the power of that tsunami. Waves nearly 20 feet high smashed India, washing up 3 miles inland and killing nearly 7,000 people. The waves hammered the Maldives, the Seychelles, and Myanmar. The monster waves even traveled as far as the eastern coast of Africa, thousands of miles away. In Somalia, the topography of the southern coastline caused enormous waves to roll up the beautiful sandy beaches and engulf entire towns. 300 people were killed in Somalia. Meanwhile, Tanzania lost 11 people, and even Kenya suffered a death. The total death toll for this tsunami was mind-boggling. 250,000 people are known to have died, although exact counts are hard to come by, as many of these countries have poor record-keeping and the numbers are just too vast. Some experts put the death toll as high as 340,000. No matter the discrepancy in official results, one thing is clear. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was one of the biggest natural disasters in recorded history, the Black Plague being only the worst one. The death toll was compounded by the vulnerability of the people who lived along the Indian Ocean coastline. That is, mostly poor and mostly underserved by inefficient and corrupt governments. Infrastructure in all but a handful of these countries was lacking, and they were unable to manage the scale of the disaster. Finally, the one thing that the entire Indian Ocean was lacking was a tsunami warning system. But there was a silver lining to it, if it can be called that. Not only did the world respond with the greatest humanitarian mission in history, allocating billions of dollars of aid to the affected area, mobilizing world's NGOs, navies, and armies, but the scientific community found itself suddenly well-funded. This meant money poured into tsunami research, and with so much video evidence of the tsunami available from Thailand, scientists were given an amazing wealth of information to study, and with that came knowledge into how tsunamis work that could be used to save lives. Chapter 4. Science. Never trust a tsunami, no matter how small it looks. Far too many people rush to the shore to see one for themselves when they learn of an inbound tsunami. For example, following the 2011 tsunami which battered Japan, thousands of people in Hawaii, California, and Australia flocked to the coastline to catch a glimpse. Luckily, it was small enough by the time it reached North America that most people were safe, although there was at least one death in California. These people didn't heed the warnings. They wanted to film it. They wanted to see it for themselves and put it on YouTube. But there's one natural disaster which people should stay away from. It's a tsunami. That's because tsunamis are one of the most destructive forces of nature on the planet, and it all stems from the way they're created, how they move, and what happens when they hit. Those who understand the mechanics behind a tsunami know to get away as soon as possible. For starters, tsunamis are not regular waves. Regular waves are caused by a combination of wind and tide, which means it's only the surface of the water which is moving. In fact, despite appearances, with a regular wave, the water itself is barely moving. Instead, the molecules that make up water are transferring energy from one column to another, which is why waves often appear to stand still on the surface. Think of a game of telephone. The message is going from one person to the next, but the people themselves aren't moving. The energy ripples through the surface of the water, and it only breaks on shore when gravity pulls the crest of the leading waves down. This is how regular waves work, but that's not how tsunamis work. Another mistake people make is to call tsunamis tidal waves, but this is a misnomer, as tidal waves are simply big waves. They're big normal waves. They're big, but they don't pack the kind of punch that a tsunami has. A tsunami is an entirely different beast. Tsunamis consist of the entire body of water lurching forward at high speed. All of it. This is the entire ocean moving, from the surface of the water to the bottom of the ocean floor. This phenomenon is a result of a massive displacement of the water. In the case of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the seabed suddenly reared up over 60 feet. The result was that all of the water above was pushed upward and away violently, and a giant tsunami was created. But other seismic events can cause a tsunami as well. The U.S. Tsunami Warning Center writes, and I quote, "Large earthquakes below or near the ocean floor are the most common cause, but landslides, volcanic activity, certain types of weather, and near-Earth objects, examples asteroids, comets, can also cause tsunamis." That's from the National Weather Service Tsunami Warning Center website. Back to the book. There are lots of things that can cause a tsunami. While earthquakes cause the majority of them, landslides have been known to create monster tsunamis. For example, in 1958, a small earthquake rocked Lituya Bay, Alaska. This earthquake caused part of a mountain to collapse into the bay. The result was a mega tsunami that reached 1,700 feet high. 1,700 feet. This wave was taller than the Empire State Building in New York City. It ravaged the coastline of the bay, tearing away the sides of hills and mountains. Thankfully, the bay was uninhabited by people, and there were only 2 deaths. I say only because it could have been more. Even for 1 death, that's a tragedy. Anyways, back to the book. One witness, a local fisherman named Howard Ulrich, who was boating with his 8-year-old son at the time, saw the wall of water rise up in front of them. He said, "It was a mountain of water filled with logs coming right at us." Ulrich and his son survived by revving a boat's engine and driving right at the tsunami. The boat actually crested the top of the wave and sailed down the back of it. A few other boaters managed to get away as well. Tsunamis can be man-made, although these are on a much smaller scale. One of the most common ways is for when scientists create tsunamis in order to study the behavior and effects of them. In specialized wave pools, most notably the one at Oregon State University, researchers build model cities and coastlines, and then use a mechanical wall to displace hundreds of pounds of water in a giant pool. They can send a tsunami crashing onto their models. They put electronic sensors throughout the pool, and they even float sensors on the water. As the scientists study the mini tsunami from a safe platform above the pool, they're able to gather valuable data that saves lives. No matter how tsunamis are born, the physics behind these killer waves remain the same. Once the water column has been displaced, it moves forward at high speed. In the case of a megathrust earthquake, there are actually 2 different types of tsunamis that radiate out from the center. The leading waves are formed on the side of the plate which thrust upwards. This thrust creates a series of massive swells in the ocean that travel forward at high speeds. However, after that, the water column gets popped upwards and outwards, a trough is created. Think of the space between the waves. This trough creates its own waves as the water races to fill in the void. The tsunami which hit most of Thailand was of this variety. The water appeared to recede from the shore as the trough reached lands first, followed up by waves racing behind it. However, not all tsunamis are preceded like this. In Sumatra and Sri Lanka, there is no such warning. They were hit directly by the swells and not the troughs. As the tsunami travels through the water, it can be barely visible on the surface, especially in the deep ocean. However, the tsunami is still there. In fact, the entire water column from the surface to the ocean floor is the tsunami. It's like an underwater wall of energy plowing forward. Divers off the coast of Khao Lak in 2004 described suddenly being spun around and dragged downwards. The clear blue water instantly turned murky and full of sand. Meanwhile, up above them, their dive boat rocked gently on a bit of perturbed water. Otherwise, the people on board barely registered anything out of the ordinary. The same phenomenon can be seen in videos from the 2011 tsunami in Japan. In one famous video, a Japanese Coast Guard vessel filmed as they sailed up and over a tsunami swell. As an aside, I love that video. I love the reaction of the Coast Guard. Oh, that's cool. Anyways, back to the book. As the tsunami gets closer to land, the bottom of the ocean becomes more shallow. The tsunami rides up along the bottom, and the swell on the surface grows taller. The entire water column that was set in motion by the initial displacement is now riding up. It's as if the entire ocean is reared up above the land. Depending on how narrow and shallow the individual bays and inlets along the shoreline is, the wave that hits can grow from 10 feet to over 100 feet high. Monster tsunami waves, like that in Alaska, can rise up thousands of feet. While the wave is rising up above the shoreline, the water behind it is still pushing into it. Gravity slows the front of the wave while the back is still moving quickly. The result is water piling up on top of itself until it all crashes down onto the shore and rages forward across the land, as more water comes up behind it and continues to push the water column inland. And because tsunamis consist of a series of waves, the next wave and the wave after that ride over the surface of the wave in front of it, reaching even further inland. In this way, tsunamis can plow an entire city into the ground. During the 2004 tsunami, at least 4 separate monster waves battered Thailand, and a few killer waves followed by smaller but still devastating waves hammered Sri Lanka. In 2011, at least 6 waves battered Japan. Newton's first principle of physics is that an object in motion will stay in motion until it meets an equal or greater force, and I've paraphrased it, but that's basically what it is. As the tsunami travels inland, it rips up vegetation and man-made structures with alarming power. The energy stored inside that column of water can sometimes be greater than the energy of an atomic bomb. At that speed, and with that energy, water acts as a solid wall. It doesn't flow around objects. Instead, it smashes them to pieces. The human body, hit by even a small tsunami wave, can be pounded into a bloody pulp. It's the same as getting hit by a bus moving at high speed. Even buildings with weak foundations get turned into matchsticks by this force. Only an equal or greater force, such as a mountain or a reinforced concrete building, can withstand this awesome power. So as the tsunami plows its way inland, it smashes apart everything in its way, gobbling it up and carrying it away. This debris piles up and creates a deadly blender effect within the rolling water. The trees, rocks, and human-made junk within the tsunami will slice and smash anything that gets sucked into it, which is often the primary reason tsunamis are so deadly. Many survivors of both the 2004 tsunami and the 2011 tsunami suffered from severed, broken, and dislocated limbs as a result of being smashed around by all the debris. Finally, after all the waves have lost their energy and destroyed the coastline, the water starts to roll back into the ocean. Although the waves are gone, this process is still part of the tsunami experience. The water, which measures in the billions of gallons, flows back off the land. It drags everything that it tore up along with it. In this way, an entire debris field will get washed out to sea. Most of the bodies of its victims will also end up out there. Many survivors who didn't drown or get cut to pieces in the maelstrom will also end up getting sucked out to the ocean. One of my favorite stories of the 2004 tsunami comes from a survivor of Banda Aceh. Rizal Saputra was a construction worker who was fixing a mosque on the morning the tsunami struck. He recalls the moment the wave struck. He told The Telegraph in a 2014 interview that he remembers a bolt of noise like a helicopter. He continues, and I quote, "My dad told me to run, and when I turned my back, the wave had swept away my house. I couldn't see my house or my family. Rizal climbed a mango tree, but the water tore that up from the ground." Rizal remembered what his grandfather taught him about knots. He got sucked out to sea. He tied together coconuts and mangoes and floating debris and built himself a raft. After 9 days at sea, he was rescued by the Malaysian Coast Guard. That's from Ari Bezer in an article in The Telegraph. Back to the book. Following the 2011 tsunami disaster in northern Japan, I was fascinated by news footage of humongous whirlpools off the coast. These things measured a few miles across. According to scientists, whirlpools are a fairly common event following a tsunami. As the water flows back from the land, it interacts with the water that has been sitting still, and the whole mess starts to spin around. If there's any type of downdraft, it could cause a vortex. That said, researchers don't have too much data on the structure of these tsunami whirlpools. Since 2004, researchers have been working with government agencies all around the world to increase tsunami warning systems and defenses. The biggest network in the world is the U.S. Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, based in Hawaii, but it works in conjunction with other governments throughout the Pacific and Indian Oceans, coordinated through the United Nations Pacific Tsunami Warning and Mitigation System. Thanks to research conducted on tsunamis, our understanding of how these monsters work has provided ingenious methods to detect them. The tsunami warning system consists of seismic monitoring and deep water gauges. First, seismic monitors that can detect earthquakes are placed along known fault lines and subduction zones on the seabed. Then a vast network of gauges suspended in the water by buoys can detect when a wall of water is moving through the ocean. The buoys have long chains traveling from the surface of the ocean to an anchor on the ocean floor. The sensors are located along this chain. At the top of each buoy, there's a transmitter, which relays data to satellites orbiting above. Once the tsunami is detected, several series of buoys can determine its direction and speed. Scientists can quickly ascertain where it will make landfall and when, and they can send out a warning to the governments of the affected areas. It's then up to the local authorities to initiate evacuation procedures. Another common defense against tsunamis, used for centuries in Japan, is massive underwater seawalls that can blunt the power of a tsunami. Because most of the tsunami is underwater, a heavily reinforced underwater seawall can cause a tsunami to break before it reaches land. However, as we shall see soon, these walls don't always work. So, a tsunami is created by a massive disruption of water. In a way, they are a symptom of a disaster, not the cause. And they are one of the most devastating natural events on the planet. So the next time you hear of the approach of a tsunami, head to high ground. Don't mess around. Chapter 5, 2011. Now, if there is one nation familiar with the power of tsunamis, it's Japan. In fact, the word tsunami is itself a Japanese word, which means harbor wave. The first recorded tsunami in Japan struck in the year 684, and another monstrous tsunami devoured Nankai and Kyoto in 887. Both of those killed thousands. In fact, Japan has had so many tsunamis that by the late Middle Ages, the Japanese prefectures, despite being in a state of civil war with each other, were building harbor walls to protect their lands. So in March 2011, when another subduction zone, this time off the coast of Japan, slipped, Japan's tsunami warning systems went into action. The earthquake itself was another of those monster megathrusts, quakes like the one off the coast of Indonesia. In fact, the Tohoku earthquake is the fourth largest in history. This time, the enormous Pacific plate had been subducting underneath the Eurasian plate. Both of these plates cover vast areas, making up over a third of the world's crust. At the epicenter, just 75 miles off the coast of the Japanese Tohoku Peninsula, the Pacific plate snapped back up. 35 miles below the ocean surface, the seabed suddenly popped up and rocked the Eurasian plate for 6 full minutes. In Japan, the ground shook violently. Buildings in Tokyo, which had been retrofitted to withstand earthquakes, nevertheless swayed like dandelions in the wind. In a process known as liquefaction, the ground opened up in cracks all over Japan, and water flowed to the surface. This happens thanks to the squeezing pressure of the earthquake. Moisture in the dirt gets compressed and flows to the surface. This stunned a lot of witnesses. In shops, shelving units collapsed, and in schools, students took cover under their desks as ceiling tiles cascaded down around them. Thankfully, there were very few injuries from this earthquake. The Japanese are well practiced in earthquake emergencies. The islands that make up Japan lie directly on top of the western arm of the deadly Ring of Fire. This is the ring surrounding the Pacific plate which circles Asia, the Arctic, and comes along the west coast of North America. The Ring of Fire is the cause of hundreds of earthquakes every year, along with volcanoes, landslides, and, of course, tsunamis. Most of these earthquakes go unnoticed, but every now and again there's a big one. In 2011, Japan experienced one of these. The earthquake registered 9.1 on the Richter scale, putting it in the top 5 most powerful earthquakes ever recorded. Like with the Sumatra earthquake, the Earth wobbled on its axis and the day was shortened by a few milliseconds. However, the Japanese weren't worried about the earthquake. Being on the Ring of Fire, they knew most of the damage would be superficial. What concerned them the most was the threat of a tsunami, which was sure to follow. Moments after the main tremor subsided, and there were 6 more waves of minor tremors, the Japanese government issued a tsunami alert. Japan's tsunami warning system had immediately detected monster waves heading right for northeastern Japan. The Coast Guard and government helicopters were dispatched to follow the tsunami as it approached land. Meanwhile, alarms throughout coastal towns and cities blared, and people's cell phones rang with automated warnings, urging people to seek higher ground. Hundreds of thousands fled for the hills and tall buildings. In the city of Sendai, airport employees grounded all the flights and immediately evacuated all the aircraft which were still on the tarmac. Everyone was rushed to the roof of the airport. This action was later credited with saving more than 6,000 people. However, all along the coast, tens of thousands of people ignored the warnings. Many employers actually forbid their employees to leave work, and local police and fire departments were unable to help all of the elderly people. Of course, in any disaster, there are people who can't believe that anything out of the ordinary could possibly happen in their lives. They are often the first victims of their own ignorance. Off the coast of Miyagi Prefecture, an NHK news helicopter crew hovering over the ocean was able to film a spectacular sight. Row upon row of humongous waves rocketing through a black ocean towards the beaches of Japan. The helicopter followed the waves as they smashed into the shore and then flowed like a torrent inland. People around the world watched the live stream. Miyagi Prefecture is the center of the Tohoku Peninsula and sits along the Pacific Ocean. The center of the prefecture consists of fertile plains which make for excellent farmland. These plains are some of the flattest regions of Japan. Meanwhile, the capital city of the prefecture, Sendai, is situated right on the coast. With a population of over 3 million people, it's the largest city in the region. The wave which hit Miyagi Prefecture was nearly 15 feet high. Thanks to the flat land, the tsunami was able to roll inland up to 6 miles. The airport at Sendai was right in its way, and people safely on the roof filmed the tsunami as it washed away cars and airplanes. But the tsunami kept on going, swallowing up all of the countryside while the NHK filmed from the air. Cars could be seen miles inland attempting to flee and then being swept up in a black wall of water filled with debris. But Miyagi wasn't the worst region hit by the 2011 tsunami. In the seaside town of Ofunato, a shallow bay helped to compress the energy of the earthquake and caused the water to rear up 130 feet high, where it sheared off the tops of tall cliffs and smashed the tiny harbor town into smithereens. Ofunato is part of the Iwate Prefecture, another region of Japan devastated. There were 40,000 people in the town on the day of the tsunami, and many people rushed to the town's official tsunami safety zones. However, 6 of these zones weren't high enough, and the people sheltering there were washed away. Damir Hyono with Reuters interviewed a survivor, and I quote, "Suzuki, 40, followed instructions broadcast on loudspeakers and headed up to the 3rd floor of the Civic Center that her city had designated as a tsunami evacuation point. As she ran up the steps, a 46-foot tsunami smashed through the building, its swirling black water swallowing everyone around her. Black water broke into the building through the windows with a rumbling noise, and I was just helplessly tossed around by the water. I don't even remember how I was swept along." She found herself in a cluster of a dozen people dragged into a room where the water kept rising. About 10 centimeters from the ceiling, Suzuki told Reuters journalists she had accompanied back to the scene of her life and death struggle just over 3 weeks earlier. Again, this is from the, I'm still quoting from the article. "I was thinking if the water rises a little bit, I'm finished. But fortunately, the water suddenly stopped rising and began receding." Again, that's from Damir Hyun-oh, who wrote an article for Reuters, and you can find that online. Back to the story. In Onagawa, another town in the Miyagi prefecture, the tsunami reached 50 feet high, a massive wall of water that rolled over the harbor wall meant to protect against tsunamis. Smaller buildings were shorn from their foundations and joined the torrent of debris that engulfed the entire coast. 12 of the town's 25 evacuation zones were washed away. One witness recalls, "I saw the elementary school hit enormously by the tsunami, making incredible spray. After a while, the tsunami hit my home, but it stood strongly against the current. I thought we had survived, but this was only the beginning of the tsunami's power. The water level grew rapidly higher and higher until it reached the ceiling." And that's from an article by Ari Bezer. Back to the book. Everywhere along the northern coastline of Japan, the same scenes were played out, often filmed by people on their smartphones and uploaded to YouTube. In Kamaishi, the water reached 30 feet high. It washed away entire warehouses and flooded the city up to 3 miles inland. Kamaishi suffered extensive damage and lost several of its safety zones, as well as 3 schools. What surprised people about the destruction in Kamaishi was the fact that just 2 years earlier, the government had constructed the world's largest breakwater. They had spent $1.5 billion on building a 200-foot seawall designed specifically to stop tsunamis. But 2 things had played against the wall, and these affected the entire coastline in the path of the tsunami. First, the size of the tsunami was unexpected. Most tsunamis are less than 10 feet high, and although they can cause massive destruction and death, well-planned seawalls can stop them. In 2011, the tsunami that hit Japan towered between 20 feet and 50 feet in height, much bigger than what planners had prepared for. Second, the seawalls they built up and down the coast were mostly underwater. Now, this is only a few feet of the top of each wall is visible. This is because, and I'm going off the script here, is to blunt the power of the tsunami, which the majority of it is below the water. So the idea is that put the wall below the water, it'll break up the tsunami, and they should work. They do work, in fact, but not this time. Let's go back to the book. With a 10-foot tsunami, this would be acceptable, as the underwater portion of the wall would blunt most of the energy of the tsunami. But something happened during the earthquake that surprised investigators afterward. They found that large parts of Japan's coastline actually sank as the Eurasian plate shook. Many of the seawalls designed to blunt a 10-foot tsunami dropped down at least 5 to 10 feet. The end result was smaller seawalls and taller tsunamis than anybody had planned for. The ocean rolled right over them. One of the worst hit regions during the tsunami was Ishinomaki. I apologize for my bad pronunciation of these Japanese towns. This is a mid-sized city with a population of nearly 150,000 people. It sits in the north of Miyagi Prefecture, bordered by tall hills and mountains on the northern side and a beautiful coastal bay to the south. On the 11th of March 2011, a series of 30-foot tsunami waves battered the city. The ocean spilled over their protective walls and created a fast-moving flood. 80% of the city's buildings were destroyed, including a dozen schools and a hospital. Every tsunami causes environmental destruction. Sometimes the effects of the tsunami last for thousands of years. For example, in 2015, geologists discovered the scars from a massive tsunami on the sides of the Fogo volcano, an island off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. The tsunami had sheared away the mountain and hurled massive boulders 560 feet up into the volcano. It happened 73,000 years ago, but what happened in Japan in 2011 was a global environmental disaster. The tsunami caused the Fukushima nuclear power plant to melt down, and we're all familiar with that one. Now, the Fukushima nuclear complex sat right on the coast in Okuma, Fukushima Prefecture. It was right in the path of a 30-foot tsunami wave which easily washed over the protecting seawall and slammed into a building that housed emergency diesel generators. When the earthquake had first struck, the power plant had immediately shut down its reactor cores in order to prevent the earthquake from damaging them. Now, normally the power plant provides its own power to cool its fission reactors. Nuclear energy gets really hot. With the system shut down, emergency diesel generators powered on to take over the cooling. The entire process was designed to protect the reactors from an earthquake, but nobody thought of protecting the diesel generators. When the tsunami obliterated the small, flimsy building housing those generators, the reactors began to overheat. They suddenly had no cooling. The the Fukushima nuclear power plant began to melt down. While the Fukushima disaster was its own catastrophe, the damage to the environment and to human infrastructure was typical of tsunami disasters. That is, the damage is extensive. According to the SMS Tsunami Warning Project, a tsunami, and I quote, uproots trees and plants and destroys animal habitat such as nesting sites for birds. They continue, and I quote again, contamination of soil and water is the second key impact of a tsunami. Salination of water bodies such as rivers, wells, inland lakes, and aquifers can occur in most cases. End quote. That's from Tsunamis, The Effects, from the SMS Tsunami Warning Project. You can find that online. Back to the book. Following the 2011 tsunami, the Japanese government identified the debris and environmental impact of the disaster as their greatest challenge. In fact, there were 4 post-disaster areas that hindered recovery. They were, first, canals meant for distribution of fresh water for agriculture were completely contaminated with sea salt, toxic chemicals, and nuclear waste. Second, freshwater infrastructure for drinking and washing was completely destroyed. Third, the entire coastal ecosystem of northeastern Japan was destroyed, including the loss of forests, bird habitats, and fish spawning grounds. And finally, vast debris fields hindered rescue, cleanup, and construction efforts. If those weren't enough, the International Atomic Energy Agency rated Fukushima and the surrounding prefectures as a nuclear contamination site unfit for human habitation. This was a biblical-scale natural disaster compounded by a Chernobyl-sized nuclear disaster. Japan responded to the tsunami immediately. Unlike the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, which devastated developing nations, Japan is a highly developed first-world nation with state-of-the-art infrastructure. The government mobilized 100,000 troops to the affected areas, and help came from the U.S. Navy as well as from New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, and India. Still, more than 100,000 people had to be put in shelters. It was a chilly, wintry March day when the tsunami struck, and the survivors were shocked and cold with no homes to return to. All up and down the coast, military helicopters and trucks went back and forth, transporting groups of homeless survivors to warm shelters and safer areas. Eventually, nearly 500,000 people ended up in shelters. Unfortunately, most of them lost loved ones. The tsunami claimed between 30,000 and 40,000 victims. Again, body counts for such huge disasters are really hard to come by accurately. Even for a country as advanced as Japan, we know that it's between 30 and 40,000 dead. We just don't know the exact numbers. And it's compounded by the fact that the bodies are dragged out to sea. So we'll never know. We'll never know. Each family will grieve someone lost, but we'll never know the exact number of dead. Just like with the 2004 tsunami, it dragged most of the bodies back out to sea. Families had to make do with memorials. In terms of pure destruction, the tsunami cost Japan $199 billion. This is one of the costliest natural disasters in modern history. Excuse me. Much of Japan's northeast was destroyed, and the insurance industry was rocked to its foundations. Also, the loss of life, the nuclear meltdown, and a widespread environmental catastrophe would change Japan forever. Even in 2020, 9 years after the disaster, the northeast of Japan is still recovering. Entire towns remain abandoned. Several coastal villages were never rebuilt, their surviving inhabitants fleeing to other cities and not returning. Tsunamis cause long-lasting destruction, not only physically, but also economically and culturally. Unfortunately, these are lessons that leaders in North America have not learned, and this is exactly where the next big one is going to hit. The final chapter, the next one. Where will the next big tsunami strike? The odds are strongly in favor of one spot in particular, the Cascadia subduction zone off the coast of northwest Canada and the USA. This is another subduction zone in the Ring of Fire, where the Juan de Fuca plate is constantly sliding under the North America plate. The entire zone covers hundreds of miles off the Pacific coast of North America, from the Queen Charlotte Islands, traditionally the Haida Gwaii, along Vancouver Island and heading south past Seattle, Portland, and ending just north of San Francisco, California. According to the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, the Cascadia subduction zone, quote, may be unique among the world's subduction zones in that it produces very few, if any, earthquakes unambiguously on the plate interface. Coupled with evident occurrence of great megathrust earthquakes, the CSZ, that's the Cascadia subduction zone, must be much more strongly locked than other subduction zones. That's from the National Weather Service, Pacific Northwest Seismic Network. You can find that online. Back to the book. Geologists know it will happen. The only question is when. To find out, researchers looked back at the natural history of the Pacific Northwest, and what they discovered is a warning. First, they discovered preserved tree trunks under the mud just off the coast all up and down the area. Large parts of the seabed all along the zone used to be above the water and was covered in forest. At some point, it sank beneath the ocean, much like how the coast of Japan sank in 2011. Through analysis of the tree rings, researchers put the date of the event at some point just after 1699. Then, along the Copalis River, geologists discovered a layer of ocean sand that had been deposited miles from the coast. Evidence of the sudden destruction of trees and the quick deposit of silt showed a massive tsunami had reached far inland. Once again, they were able to ascertain a date of just after 1699. In fact, all along the Pacific Northwest coastline, there's evidence of a sudden coastal drop and a massive tsunami which reached at least 60 feet high. But the clincher in the argument came from far away on the other side of the Pacific. Now, the Japanese have been keeping detailed records of events on their islands since at least 600 CE. That's Common Era, used to be called AD. Among these records are numerous accounts of various tsunamis, including one particularly destructive wave which hit in January 1700. There were no reports of an earthquake in Japan. The tsunami seems to have taken the islands by surprise. It reared up out of nowhere, having traveled from a long way away. Put together, researchers unanimously agree that in early 1700, the Cascadia subduction zone experienced a massive megathrust earthquake, which destroyed thousands of miles of coastline and sent a devastating tsunami racing across the Pacific. Tales from the local native inhabitants speak of a terrible earthquake and tsunami all up and down the coast. In Northern California in 1700, the Yurok people gathered on high hills and looked down as the ocean swallowed their village and the forests below them. Much further north, the Nuu-chah-nulth of British Columbia speak of a thunderbird and a whale fighting so much that the earth shook violently, and then the ocean flooded in and took their homes and their children and their canoes. The date of this event is January 1700. Researchers can paint a picture of the devastating earthquake of 1700. It had a magnitude of around 9.2, and the rupture was over 600 miles long, from Vancouver Island to Northern California. It caused a 66-foot underwater ridge to form and sank the coastline by up to 10 feet. Also, it caused a devastating tsunami to flood everything for miles inland. We know it happened at least once before, and it's going to happen again. So what will the Cascadia earthquake and tsunami look like? The thing about the Cascadia subduction zone is that it is guaranteed to pop one day in the future, and when it does, the earthquake will be as large as those off the coast of Japan in 2011 and Sumatra in 2004. Geologists expect at least a 9 on the Richter scale. The result will be a catastrophic tsunami. With several large urban areas directly in the path, it'll be one of North America's biggest disasters. The first thing people all along the coast will feel is a violent earthquake. The earth will shake even as far as Alaska and as far west as Hawaii. Communities along the coast will suffer destruction if the shelf slips under the sea. Many buildings in Seattle and Portland have been retrofitted with earthquake-proof technology, but smaller towns and the unprepared metropolis of Vancouver will suffer severe damage. There will most likely be landslides all up and down the coast, burying entire towns. Between 100 miles and 200 miles out to sea, and several miles below the surface of the water, there will be a massive continental thrust. A large wall of rock will suddenly pop up, maybe as high as 50 feet. This will displace millions of tons of ocean, pushing a massive column of water upwards. That column of water will race east towards North America and west towards Japan. Like in 2004, when the tsunami smashed into Banda Aceh a few minutes after the earthquake, the first killer waves will hit the US and Canada quickly. It will take less than 20 minutes for the ocean to rear up over dozens of coastal communities. Coos Bay, Newport, Astoria, Ocean Shores, Bamfield, Ucluelet, and Tofino will be completely swallowed. The tsunami will be anywhere from 15 feet to 50 feet high, and there will be a series of them, each one riding on top of the other to create a fast-moving flood. Most of the coastal rainforest and redwood forest along this part of the coast will be flooded. Trees will get torn up and will turn the tsunami into a battering ram. Then the tsunami will flood up the Columbia River. This swell will wash over large parts of Longview, Oregon, and cause extensive flooding damage even as far inland as Portland. Meanwhile, as the tsunami reaches the narrow Juan de Fuca Strait between Vancouver Island and Washington State, it will become compressed. Here the tsunami will grow in height as fast-moving water piles onto it from behind. It will tower over Port Angeles, completely obliterating the town and anyone in it. The city of Victoria, the jewel of Canada, will experience a powerful wave that smashes apart its waterfront and historic downtown. By the time Seattle experiences the might of the Cascadia tsunami, it will come as a rolling wall of water rather than a giant wave. This will roll up Puget Sound, engulfing all the towns along the way. Everett, Shoreline, Hansville, and others will get swamped. Seattle itself will be inundated, situated as it is along a strip of land, much like how Koh Phi Phi was in Thailand. Even Tacoma will be completely flooded. To the north, the tsunami will wrap around Vancouver Island, much like it did with Koh Phi Phi and Sri Lanka. Port Hardy will be inundated by a wall of water. The tsunami will swell down the Queen Charlotte Strait from the north. The city of Vancouver, British Columbia, is one of the largest cities on the Pacific Northwest. It will experience drastic flooding, but thanks to the islands in the Discovery Passage and the Haro Strait, the brunt of the tsunami will have been broken. In fact, so long as Vancouver can withstand the earthquake, the city itself will be relatively unharmed. Nevertheless, thousands of people all up and down the coast will die. There could be 10,000 deaths or more. There'll be twice that number of injured, and 100,000 or more rendered homeless. Just like with the Indian Ocean and Japan, infrastructure all along the coast will be virtually wiped out. There will be no power, no clean drinking water, no warm shelter. Roads and bridges will have been washed away. It will take a massive military effort to rescue several million people stranded in the zone. And it will take years to identify the dead and the missing. But it gets worse. Aid will be slow getting into communities that become isolated due to the destruction. Across the ocean, the tsunami won't have lost any of its power by the time it hits Japan. This time, Tokyo, the world's most populous city, will face a catastrophe if its tsunami defenses don't hold. However, Tokyo has been preparing for this for decades, and they've learned a lot of lessons from 2011. Unlike in Japan, the US and Canadian governments haven't taken the threat of a tsunami seriously. Geologists have been warning them for years that a big one will strike sometime. But North American politicians continue to pass the buck along to someone else. In Vancouver, report after report has recommended a massive earthquake-proofing program to retrofit more than 1,100 buildings. City Council continues to ignore these warnings. In 2018, Canada's Global News ran a piece about the inevitable earthquake and tsunami that will hit, and I quote, "Experts in BC and the US estimated that the number of deaths could be more than 10,000 people. Waves could be anywhere from 15 meters to 20 meters, Chris Goldfinger, a professor of geophysics at Oregon State University, told CNN. And now here's a quote within a quote. Further inland and into the Strait of Georgia, it would take a longer period of time. Victoria would have about an hour of warning, and Vancouver would have quite a bit more time." Unquote. That's from Katie Dangerfield for Global News in 2018. Back to the story. Unfortunately, it's the same story in Seattle, where City Council has ignored multiple reports from staff and experts warning that a massive earthquake is due. Less than 14% of the city's buildings can withstand a small earthquake, let alone the megathrust earthquake that's going to hit. But even worse than the lack of preparedness for an earthquake is the disaster that is North America's tsunami preparedness. In Oregon, Republican lawmakers revoked a building code that prevented municipalities from building in tsunami zones. Now there are schools, hospitals, homes, and even a couple of police stations constructed exactly where a massive tsunami is expected to make landfall. Washington state seems better prepared, holding regular drills and banning construction of critical infrastructure in tsunami zones. In British Columbia, Canada, the government hasn't done much more than put up a few signs that read "Tsunami Evacuation Route," but most citizens don't know where they lead to. There are also no anti-tsunami sea walls along the coastline of any of these states or provinces. A big tsunami is going to hit the Pacific Northwest, devastating Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Northern California. It's happened before, and the next one is due any day. It could be in 10 years, or it could be in the next hour. But one thing is clear, nobody takes a threat seriously, and no government has taken steps to prepare for it. Now, that's everything I'm going to read today from Opus Tsunami. There's a epilogue, of course, so I didn't read the prologue or the epilogue. You can read those yourself if you want. Like I said, you can get Opus Tsunami free by signing up to my email newsletter, which is literally like one every couple of months. But I will give you a free book, so that's a cool deal, isn't it? Or you can buy it for $1.99 at Amazon. Just look for Opus Tsunami by Nathan A. Drescher, and it'll be there. You can go to my website too, and you can buy it from there. So, thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that, like I said, if you want more, then just go read the book yourself. I'm working on another book right now. I'm working on a couple of novels. My first novel is Moscow Cowboy. Grizzled old cowboy from Alberta ends up in modern day Moscow, Russia. So, and I'm also working on an actual book, science fiction book that will be about this Cascadia tsunami that's bound to hit the Pacific Northwest. So keep an eye out for that. That will be at least 1 or 2 years before that one comes out. Thanks again for reading, and sorry for listening to me read. And yeah, I wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year.